around the age of 25, someone gave me a book, a conspiracy book on the assassination. And there were so many questions in there I didn't realize that were unanswered that I needed to investigate further. And it became like a lifelong ambition of mine to get to the truth. So for about the last, say, close to 40 years, I have devoted most of my energy to investigating the assassination of JFK. Now, I got to a point, as everyone does, you read different things, and you read about the CIA and the mafia and Cuban exiles and all of this, and you ask yourself, how did these groups come together? They can't all have been involved en masse in an assassination. There must be something. And I wanted to know why. And there were also some circumstances that had large questions in my mind, like why, when Oswald was arrested, did he ask for a lawyer named John Abt, who represented communists, and everyone said, okay, that's why Oswald asked for him. Well, no. John Abt at the time was the only attorney in the country to ever defend someone against the Smith Act, which was instituted after World War II, that said you could try people for trying to take over the country. That's why Oswald wanted him. Then I asked myself, why is it that with all the talk of Cuba, from hiring the mafia to try and assassinate Castro, to the Bay of Pigs, to all kinds of attempts to get rid of Castro, Oswald gets arrested, member of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, defected to the Soviet Union, goes to Mexico 2 months before the assassination, trying to get to Cuba. He's accused of the assassination. No one else is even considered, and nothing happens. They ignore that. And then in roughly 26 months within the assassination, before and after, there are 15 government overthrows and assassinations around the world, all leftist leaders that were removed. And in the middle of this, we're supposed to believe that one left-wing assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, shot and killed our president. It didn't make sense. So I started backtracking and thought, maybe I can find out why, in the years prior to Kennedy's assassination, something to make sense of all of these facts that just didn't settle in my mind. And it took me back all the way to the 1920s. And it was all about anti-communism and post-World War I. It started with eugenics, which was a pseudoscience that people in power that wanted to restrict immigration to just, say, Northern Europeans, Aryans, Anglo-Saxons. They used eugenics as a means to justify keeping other people out. So in 1924, they passed the Immigration Act, which basically did that, limited everyone but Northern Europeans. Then as we led up to World War II or the Depression, there was an attempt to remove FDR from office. It involved the DuPont family, Rockefellers, different people. It went in front of Congress. Their plan was to take 500,000 American Legion soldiers and basically give FDR a choice. Either you become a puppet president and we'll tell you what to do, or we're going to forcibly remove you. They contacted Smedley Butler, a colonel from World War I, who they thought they could trust, but he went to Congress. Congress investigated it. They knew it was a conspiracy. This group had sent people to Europe to see how Hitler and Mussolini had come to power. And it all died because the people were too powerful who were involved. Okay, and then as we got through World War II, there were the support for the Nazis in this country was tremendous, and in England, Europe as well, because it was mostly about anti-communism. They could accept fascism, but not communism. Then in post-World War II, it snowballed. You had the Korean War, which contrary, pointed out in the book, contrary to what the public believes, what we've been taught, it was the United States and South Korea, or I should say the military of the United States, led by MacArthur, that really instigated the Korean War. And the reason for that was there were things going on at the time that the military and the right wing could not accept. Right after World War II, the Soviets became our #1 adversary. And a fellow named George Kennan, who was a Russian diplomat stationed in Moscow, wrote, per Truman's request, President Truman, a 5,000-page telegram that is now called the Long Telegram, outlining the dangers of the Soviet Union and that their objective was to take over the United States. So he established what became US policy really for the remainder of the Cold War, what was called the Policy of Containment. The Policy of Containment said that communism would self-destruct in time if you just contained it, didn't allow it to spread, and which is what we did, right? We had missiles in Europe. We had Okinawa, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan. We created like an umbrella, an arc around the Soviets and the Chinese. Well, right around the time of Korea, Truman came to the conclusion we couldn't afford to do all of this. So he was prepared to let South Korea and Taiwan, which was Formosa at the time, go to the communists. They were on the mainland. Japan, that was in the UN, was negotiating a treaty that would have two outcomes. One was the United States could leave its military bases and nuclear weapons in Japan, where they could be removed. Things were starting to lean in the direction of the United States getting out. So with all that in mind, the only way to stop it was for the Korean War to happen, which it did. And Truman's military budget, which was going to be cut to 13 billion, wound up ballooning to 48 billion. Then after the war, it continued. The military-industrial complex, which Eisenhower talked about at the end of his presidency, actually began at the beginning. And this war machine was created where military generals would push for military expenditures going to certain government contractors. Then when those generals retired, they would go work for those contractors. So there's this industry, this military industry of enormous proportions. Grew and could not be stopped. Eisenhower knew it. That's what he was referring to. And it continued on through the Cold War. The United States tried, or the military tried repeatedly. They wanted to engage the Soviets in a nuclear confrontation. Eisenhower held out. And anyway, so that kind of led up to the Kennedy assassination.
Okay. So let's talk about the Kennedy assassination and the immediate aftermath in the 1960s.
Sure.
I never was comfortable with the lone assassin theory. I was just a kid, but it seemed to me almost impossible that one lone gunman could get so lucky, in quotes, to have this horrendous outcome. So right there and then, I think there were grounds for being concerned about what the Warren Commission was doing and the attempt to put all this on one person. And then very conveniently, that person is killed.
Right.
But here is something, a question that always bothered me and still bothered me. And you mentioned John F. Kennedy's brother, Robert Kennedy, several times in your two volumes. But I was wondering if you've thought about this question.
Mm-hmm.
His brother was killed, murdered.
Right.
He was Attorney General. It's true that Johnson didn't like him and wanted to get him out of there as soon as possible.
Right.
It's true that he didn't live that much longer himself. He was assassinated. We can talk about that as well. But why do you suppose the president's brother allowed the Warren Commission report to stand without his scathing criticism to get to the truth of this, if what you're saying was all true?
There is a record. He may not have said it directly, but he did say, and associates of his supported this, that he did not believe the Warren Commission was accurate. He came out to be politically correct and was in agreement with it. But he knew that unless he became president, he could never uncover the truth. And he wanted to be president. Okay, now he was emotionally just destroyed, right? At the time of his brother's death, they were so close. They knew, in fact, there was an associate of his and Jackie's who went to Moscow for a diplomatic mission. And he went there with a message from Robert Kennedy saying, we know you guys weren't involved. We know who, we suspect who did this. We're going to find out. He sent a fellow named Sheridan, who was his muscle man, to investigate the assassination on his own privately, while he was still Attorney General. As you know, he lasted as Attorney General for a while after the fact. Became Senator in New York and he was on his way to becoming the next president, I believe, in 1968. Okay, he was going to get the Democratic nomination. I mean, it's not by accident that Lyndon Johnson was running for president until Robert Kennedy announced he was going to run. And then like within a week or two, Lyndon Johnson backed out. So anyway, that's the reason that he had to be president to take this on.
Okay, so do you think the same American right-wing cabal that was at least in large part responsible for John F. Kennedy's assassination, were they also responsible for Robert Kennedy's assassination?
It's hard to think that isn't the case. I mean, when you look at the facts in the big picture and throw Martin Luther King into that as well. I mean, so they wanted to get rid of JFK. And one thing, JFK and his brothers created the perfect scenario, or the perfect storm, if you will. You had the possibility that John would have been president until 1968. Then if Bobby came in, he could have been president until 76. And if Teddy came in, he takes him up to 84, which is the beginning of Ronald Reagan's second term. Would have been a Kennedy dynasty. And if you were adamant that these people were detrimental to the well-being of the United States, you would have felt an obligation to get rid of them. In fact, the CIA mantra always was, wouldn't we have been better off if someone had killed Hitler early on? Obviously, the answer is yes, but early on, you don't know what a man's going to become. But anyway, so yeah, so they kill John. Robert may win 68. Martin Luther King is certainly galvanizing the black vote in favor of the Democrats. Those two get eliminated. And it paves the way for Richard Nixon to become president, who many believe had the election stolen from him in 1960 from some mob influence with JFK. So, and when you look now, then what happens? Nixon pulls out of Vietnam, if you really want to stretch it to an extreme, normalizes, he goes and visits China, goes and visits the Soviet Union, all things that violated the policy of containment. And next thing you know, the same guys who were involved in the Bay of Pigs, may have been involved in the assassination, wind up botching the Watergate break-in. Was it is it possible that was actually a setup? And now Nixon's gone?
Yeah, well, so it's tempting to tie all those things together, and I'm actually inclined to do that. But I guess where then do you draw the line? They got lucky, again, in quotes, in Chappaquiddick, so that Eddie out, or was that just so? And one of the things that I kept on thinking, I mean, it almost screamed out at me as I was reading your fascinating, provocative book. And actually, you should probably write a third and a fourth volume about this. And again, you sort of hint at this, but you don't really talk about it because obviously the books are long enough as they are. But what is the status of this right-wing cabal right now? Now, obviously, a lot of the people that you talk about, these again, quote, heroes of World War II, the people who started the CIA, the people who were furious at Eisenhower, et cetera, the people who thought that they couldn't believe that the Kennedy family had betrayed them, since Joe Kennedy, the father himself, had been one of their main ringleaders. What is their status today? And I hate to even bring this in, but were they propping Trump up? And have you given any thought about that?
You know what? You can't make a direct connection, but my opinion is the answer was no, they wouldn't be propping up Trump. And I say that for this reason. We call it the deep state today. They didn't call it the deep state back then, but there is a government that has to remain in place as one president comes to the next, right? we can't have a complete that everybody leaves, that new people come in. There has to be some consistency. And if you want to look at the Council on Foreign Relations, wherever you want to look, especially as far as foreign policy, there is a consistency. And it doesn't necessarily, when we say right wing, it doesn't equate just to Republicans, especially at the time of JFK. There are people who have a direction they want the country to go. Trump didn't fit that. Trump was going to kick over the apple cart, right? And that didn't go along with the deep state status quo. We want a direction the country to go in. We want to contain communism. And so, if anything, he violated that.
Okay, so, and you could add into that Trump's love affair with Putin, even though Putin is not an ipso facto Soviet communist, he obviously comes from that tradition, and runs Russia as in effect, and to whatever extent he can, as a reincarnation of the Soviet Union. So therefore, those people would not have favored Trump. That's I think a good answer. But I guess what I'm saying is the fundamental thesis of your book is that there are people, certainly people who were around in the United States back in the 1930s. You know, one of the most famous is Charles Lindbergh. He might not have been, you know, one of the people who actually plotted the Kennedy assassination, but there have been people around. You certainly think they're still around now. So what then are they doing now? In other words, what should we be looking for? Not that we can prevent another assassination from happening, but what evidence have you found researching the past that these forces are still at work today?
Well, when you look at anytime someone tries to change the direction of the country or get too close to what we consider our enemies, whether it be, like you say, Trump with the Russians, or Obama with the Iranians, or anybody that kind of violates the basic premise of what this country is based on, and which is that democracy is the best form of government for the world, and that everyone else will self-implode. Let's keep, we keep our allies. The one thing Trump did was just rejected our allies in Europe in particular and Southeast Asia, and which infuriated the right. I still think the Council of Foreign Relations is a place to look at, because almost every person that has run our foreign policy at Secretary of State or any kind of diplomatic position, high level, has come from there. There are think tanks, you can call them left-wing, right-wing think tanks. In some ways, they're all basically the same. There's a direction they want our country to go. And I think there's a reason why it comes from there. Now, Trump's big thing was he kicked over he named an Exxon executive as Secretary of State, correct? I mean, how far off base can you be? And everything he did at the beginning of his presidency in particular seemed to implode on him. And there was a lot of resistance within the government, which people on the far right don't like, but there is there's a consistency in government that goes from one president to the next. General MacArthur said, right after the Korean War, he said, "My allegiance is to the people and the Constitution, not to the temporary resident of the White House." And I think that holds true for presidents, no matter what party they belong to.
No, I agree. And actually, although I don't particularly like MacArthur, it's hard to disagree with that point. Let's go back again to the beginning of this, just so I and our listeners and viewers can get a better understanding of this. In effect, your thesis, which again you copiously document, is that in a way this began as an attempt to take out Adolf Hitler. And, we've all seen the movies, we know about probably the most famous plot is, the one with the German generals and they get a
Right.
bomb into the room. And by the way, you might be interested in knowing that that whole story is one of the key parts of several courses that I teach.
Oh,
Because
really?
yeah, it represents the power of radio. Because what happened is, as you know, Hitler was wounded because he was sitting at a table that it was like made out of steel, and so although the bomb was pretty close to him, that steel table absorbed a lot of the impact. So a few hours later, he's in a hospital. No one knows if he's. They know he's not dead, but he could be mortally wounded on the verge of dying. Joseph Goebbels gets the idea, Mein Führer, if we could just do a radio address to the German people,
Yes.
that would discourage any German generals from joining this dastardly plot. And Goebbels gets a radio connection into Hitler's hospital bed, and Hitler addresses the nation. And right there and then, that plot is stopped cold, because any German general who's thinking of joining, the revolt knows better than to do that. So that, by the way, shows the power of radio, which Hitler, FDR, Churchill, even Stalin all used. But okay, so one of the most interesting parts in the early points in the early part of your book is how that the Vatican thinks it is okay as part of Vatican doctrine to assassinate a tyrant.
Right.
So Hitler, right? So Hitler is obviously a tyrant. So the Vatican, even though they first were playing ball with Hitler to some extent in the early 30s, pretty soon they saw the monster they were dealing with. And the same even with some right-wing people in the United States. So they pivoted to, okay, let's try to take this guy out. They did not succeed. But your point is that what that did is it set into motion this idea that sometimes it's necessary to take out a president, a Führer, if that person is operating in a way which is going to destroy capitalism, white supremacy, etc.
Communism was the big fear of everyone, and it started even at the time of FDR, right? Because communism, if it infiltrated your country, equated to taking over unions and taking money out of people's pockets. And FDR, they looked at with the New Deal, socialist programs. And so the elites of this country wanted to do something to prevent that from happening. And it eventually led, like you're saying, to World War II and an alliance between the OSS, which was the precursor to the CIA, right, at the time, during the war, the Vatican. And the Vatican had their own network of spies in Germany and in Italy, and they were attempting to get rid of Hitler. Now, in all of this, there were the German generals who were in the Roman theater, Italian theater of war, who saw the Russians coming east or coming west from the east, and they had to be stopped. They were trying to, and at the time, Alan Dulles, future CIA director, was head CIA guy or OSS man in Switzerland, was negotiating with these German generals to try and reach some kind of an accommodation where they were willing to surrender. And what they wanted to do was to surrender, give us the right to go back and stop the Russians from coming in, and then we will eventually put over a democratic government. Dulles went to William Donovan, who was the head of OSS, who then cabled back to FDR, and FDR only accepted unconditional surrender. And they tried desperately to get him to change that. But he steadfastly maintained unconditional surrender, and the German generals, of course, could not give in to that. So eventually, World War II ended the way it did, and they could not kill. They never killed Hitler. Obviously, the record, we know that. But what happened after the war was very interesting. So you had the Russian army, the Red Army, basically around Berlin, Eastern Europe. You had the United States pulling everyone home. You had the English pulling everyone home. Basically defenseless. There was a fear that if the Red Army wanted to march across Europe, they could have taken over Europe. In fact, Churchill had set a date and ordered his military to attack the Red Army. And they explained to him that it's suicide. We can't because of the limitations there. So what happened? Right. Okay,
go ahead.
Okay, what happened after the war? Briefly, there were these groups in Eastern Europe that fought with the Nazis. They were still in place. They were the Tsarists, anti-communists, and between the OSS and eventually the CIA, and these stay-behind armies, it's called Operation Gladio. They were like a first line of defense against these people, the Russian army, and they eventually wound up bringing in the mafia into this. The mafia and the military CIA were involved together for many, many years. And they brought in opium from Southeast Asia. They had to fund this operation. They couldn't let the United States government know about it. Senate would never have approved it. And amazingly, they laundered the money through the Vatican Bank. It was all to keep the communists out of Europe.
Right. And as we know, the communists and the Soviet Union came pretty close to even overrunning Western Europe. Not only did they get a foothold in Germany, Greece was hanging in the balance. Obviously, the whole Eastern Bloc, Hungary, Poland, etc., they became satellites of the Soviet Union. The revolution in China, obviously after World War II, that became a communist country. So, it's easy for us now in 2021 to say, what were they so worried about, that they did something so extreme? They had reason to be worried. I think everyone was worried.
Yes.
But this gets me, to another question, and we can certainly talk for a few more minutes here. Having seen the devastation that the assassination of John F. Kennedy did to the country, and again followed just a few short years later by the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And as you're correctly pointing out, the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, I don't know why I threw a junior in there, the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy basically took out someone who was on the verge of becoming president. Right. Because he would have done much better than Hubert Humphrey, for sure. By the way, I was my wife and I were devout Eugene McCarthy supporters, and we didn't particularly like, Robert Kennedy coming in. But the reason that we did is we realized that, hey, Eugene McCarthy didn't stand a chance with Robert Kennedy in the contest. But anyway, did the people that you pretty convincingly show, had something to do with the assassination of John F. Kennedy, seeing the devastation that wrought on the American psyche, do you have any evidence or knowledge? Did they feel guilty about that? Obviously, they weren't thinking that it should never happen again, because the assassination of Robert Kennedy shows, again, they may have indeed orchestrated that. Has there been any evidence, people on their deathbed saying, I'm really sorry I did this, but I can't go back and change it?
None. There have been people who have admitted involvement in the JFK assassination on their deathbed or later on. To a man, they basically all think he had it coming, that they did the right thing. It's an amazing, anyone who was alive at that time and felt the pain, and they, on Sunday morning, I don't know how you found out about Ruby shooting Oswald, but I just remember my grandmother calling us at home and saying, turn on the television quick, you're not going to believe this. Or waking up in 1968 because California primary was late, waking up and finding out that John Kennedy's brother, Robert, was also shot. He wasn't pronounced dead yet, I don't believe. And he was like, not again, how could this happen? And no, I think the people who did this did it for a reason. I think they are, look, there are people in this country at the time who were prepared to have a nuclear war with the Soviets, knowing that certain cities in the United States would be obliterated. But in the final analysis, we would defeat them and it was all worth it.
Yeah,
So,
that's really chilling. Well, I'll tell you where I was in terms of Robert F. Kennedy. My then girlfriend, who became my wife, and we're still married, and we have kids and grandkids. We were on the telephone, each in our separate houses in the Bronx, watching, the returns in California. Not happy again that Robert F. Kennedy won.
right,
I mean,
right.
we knew that he would, but somehow hoping that McCarthy could have pulled it out at the last minute. And when we knew that Robert F. Kennedy had won, we were pretty much getting ready to go to sleep, and we were both watching the television when this news came over the television. And that in itself is as much seared into my memory as the assassination of John F. Kennedy. So one final question, if you have any knowledge of this. Have there been any other plots, attempted assassinations, since then that your copious research has uncovered? I mean, for example, did someone try to go after Obama at some point?
No, I think the people who were responsible for JFK, I think, are too smart if they wanted to get rid of an Obama or anybody else to understand with cell phones, cameras, and all the information that's available. They wouldn't go about it that way. They could destroy. There's ways to destroy a president today without resorting to violence. I think if it were to happen again today to any president, it's going to be someone unhinged that will, just do it on his own. I can't imagine that a group would get together and arrange. I mean, it would have to be a very sophisticated plot. It could happen, obviously, but anyway, to answer your question, no, I have no evidence that there are other assassination plots that have been foiled or that just were in the works.
All right, well, that's a ray of good hope. I do agree with you that that the world has changed a lot since November 1963. Although, as I always say, the world also froze then in a way that it's never recovered from. So listen, I think you've really done a wonderful job writing these books, and I urge everyone to read them, because if you're anything like me, if you grew up in that time, if you've always been wondering what really happened, if you felt that Mark Lane was on to something, he might not have everything right, if you were glad that Oliver Stone made that movie, and I really want to underscore, we live in a world in which anytime someone comes up with a somewhat unconventional idea, there's the Greek chorus saying, "Oh, conspiracy theory," blah, blah, blah. And this isn't a conspiracy theory. I mean, it's a theory, but it's a theory that's very, very well documented, meticulously researched. I learned all kinds of things, and that's saying a lot for me. Not that I'm incapable of learning anything new, but I've read a lot on this. But reading Walter Herbst's book, I learned an enormous amount. So, Walter, any final thoughts or comments?
The only thing I'll say is I'm working now on the third volume, which will be about the assassination itself in Kennedy years. And the book you're referring to that is out now, the 2 volumes, is about the period leading up. And I think if you read it with an open mind, when you're done, you will come to the conclusion that, yes, it is possible that Kennedy was assassinated by a conspiracy. And I'm hoping the next volume will put facts on the table as far as the actual assassination to prove that. I think we will. And I think the goal that we should have for people who believe this is, we don't need the government to say, okay, you're right, here's who did it. But I think at least we should get to the point where we could say, there is just as much evidence, if not more evidence, of a conspiracy than there is of a lone gunman. And we should give that the proper attention that it deserves, not just dismiss it and say, Lee Harvey Oswald did it, the Warren Commission said it. Unless you can prove without a shadow of a doubt that that's not the case, we're going to dismiss what you present. So that would be my final word.
Well, great. I agree with that final word 100%. So again, you'll be able to buy this book. This is being recorded on November 10th. I should mention that. It's going to be posted on November 16th. There will be links in both the show notes on YouTube and the episode notes on Light On, Light Through. A link to where you can buy this book. And Walter, I look forward to reading your next book, and we'll have you back here. Did you want to say something else?
No, that's it. It'd be a pleasure to be back. I enjoyed it very much, Walt. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Take care.
You too.